Welcome to the Freedom Lovin' Podcast. This is Kevin, and this is episode number 5. Upcoming, I have a chat with the Stateless man, Fergus Hodgson, and we get into a lot of different topics related to freedom and statelessness. We'll talk about what freedom means, how can you be stateless, why are countries and borders not compatible with freedom, and a whole bunch of other things. So stay tuned for that. I wanted to mention that this podcast is sponsored by 100mustreads.com. Speed up your business knowledge and download summaries of over 120 of the top business books, starting at just $25 by going to 100mustreads.com. So as for me, I've been traveling, making my way from San Diego to Boulder, kind of the slow way. I headed my first stop was going to be Las Vegas, but I decided to skip that because the friend that I was going to visit was out of town, and I really don't have a great affinity for Vegas, especially on a trip when I'm trying to drive for 8 hours a day or something like that. So not a good mixture there. But so now I'm staying in Salt Lake City at a friend's house. Actually, it was Jeremy who was on episode number 2, and staying with him for a couple days. And I will make my way from Salt Lake City to Boulder tomorrow, Monday. So beautiful area. We went on a hike yesterday, and it's just freaking awesome here. Weather is perfect, and sun is out. And I took some pictures on the way up, so I'll have those on the blog probably today. I'm going to upload a post, so freedomlovin.com. And one thing I learned leaving San Diego was that I always thought I've been really promoting minimalism, and I've called myself a minimalist for so long, but once I decided that I was going to pack everything I own into my car, and then I got through that, I actually had my car was 100% filled with no space left, and I still had some extra stuff. I had this duffel bag, and I had some pictures and some other things that just were not going to fit in my car. So luckily I was able to drop off the bag at a friend's, but the rest of the stuff I left at the place that I was staying, and just emailed my landlord and said I'll pick it up later. So I can't quite fit everything I own in my car, but I'm almost there. And next week I'll be having Brian from the minimalist.com on, and we're going to chat about minimalism. I'm going to figure out how I can get better at it, because I want to be even more free than what I am now. So anyway, if you like this podcast, give us a rating and review on the iTunes link. I'll have that in the show notes at freedomlovin.com. And also like our Facebook page. If you want to stay tuned with the Freedom Lovin' updates, just go to facebook.com/freedomlovinlife and give us a like there. And look forward to chatting with you guys on Facebook. And otherwise, enjoy this episode with Fergus Hodgson, and we'll talk to you soon. Go out there and build some freedom. All right. Well, I am super excited to have Fergus Hodgson on the show today. He's otherwise known as the Stateless Man at thestatelessman.com. And just wanted to read kind of what the Stateless Man is about from his website. It's a home for those who pursue individual liberty beyond arbitrary borders, oppressive governments, and myths of national obligations. If you value liberty and are willing to migrate and vote with your feet, you've come to the right place. So again, it's thestatelessman.com. Fergus, welcome to Freedom Lovin'.
Oh, it's my pleasure to be speaking with you, Kevin.
Awesome. So how did the Stateless Man come about?
Well, like many things, it's evolved over time, right? That the short story is that about a year and a half, 2 years ago, I received some sort of email update. I subscribed to a whole bunch of different email outlets, and one of them must have had me on a list and shared that there was a new network, a radio network starting, and interested people could submit pitches for a show. And naturally I did. At the time I was working as a policy researcher in North Carolina, and I proposed an idea. I'd wanted to be a radio host for a long time, and basically the creators of the new network were very pleased with my proposal, and I was one of the founding members or hosts with the Overseas Radio Network. In terms of the idea, like I said, it has been evolving, and originally I guess we didn't really know what we were doing. I never had any radio experience. And I'm probably going to be updating that show description you read there, actually, because I think many people find migration a challenge, and I don't want it to limit. Yes, my show and site is a celebration of, you could say, freedom of movement and human migration for better prospects. But at the same time, as you know, there are lots of other themes devoted. The real goal is freedom in your life, and there are lots of other ways to get there. So I investigate homeschooling, alternative education, getting out of, you could say, the education bureaucracy, and monetary freedom and other realms. So it has a broad theme. In terms of where did it come from, I think Stateless was just a name that appealed to me at the time, and other people found it interesting. So I guess it came out of my own life because I had become frustrated with, you could say, the opportunities, particularly in New Zealand, where I'm from originally, right, and decided, look, these people, far from helping me, have really messed up my life to a large degree. Mm-hmm. And I remember there were lots of epiphanies that occurred particularly when I was a university student in New Zealand, because that's when I guess I learned of new ideas, and I went to the US for 4 years and then came back. So I did kind of like 2 stints of higher education in New Zealand. And I guess at that time I just thought there was just so much insanity. I saw, for example, enormous spending on higher education and no one learning anything. I was a discussion leader or tutor at university. Yeah. I would say to the students, the New Zealand government is spending something like $30,000 per student on you. Imagine if they just gave you that money. Yeah. So I was thinking, couldn't you do a lot better than just sit in this class and pretend to care? Anyway, so I guess I had these kind of epiphanies that were just going, I don't need all this. And there's so much kind of phony demagoguery or just the ideas that seem to flow. I don't know why. And I wanted to break out of that. And I was getting a little bit frustrated. So I just said, leave New Zealand. And at that time, I bought a ticket on a credit card to go to Canada. And that was 4 years ago.
Wow. So how long were you in Canada then?
I've been in Canada a bunch of times. I'm thinking in total about a year and a half.
Okay. And then you came down to the land of the free after that?
Yeah, well, what happened is that when I first went on the road, it was just a really bad timing. That was when the financial crisis was just kind of getting rolling. And I went to Calgary, Alberta, which is, you could say, the energy boom town or the industry center of Western Canada, or corporate center. That's where people go for better prospects. It's just known as an economic haven, but basically those places that had the biggest bubble or the biggest rise had the biggest pop, and nothing much was going on there, and it was middle of winter Canada. Ugh. And so, yeah, man, it was a bad time. But basically, I flew across to Halifax in Eastern Canada for my first job offer, but I lost that job after about 3 months and was back on the road looking, and then I received a job offer from the United States, and I found my way back after about not quite a year on that occasion in Canada. But I was very pleased to come back to the United States, and then quickly, for better or worse, I built a name for myself in the United States as a writer, and then had a career to some degree without me planning it. I never thought I would be a writer. It just occurred that way.
Yeah. So you've written for a few different publications and a few websites, right?
Yeah, I've lost track at this point because what happened was that I'd written a few articles back in New Zealand for a student-oriented magazine. I had a column there for a while, and I got in a newspaper there, and I'd written an academic article in Boston, but that was my very limited experience, so probably about a dozen articles in total I'd actually had published. And then when I went to the US, my first article got in the Washington Times, and then the second one got nationally syndicated, and I was going, what happened? Who is this person? Anyway, so the second article, which got nationally syndicated, I completely lost track of how many places were publishing it, but I was just really pleased. And from that point, like I said, I had some credibility to continue on. And I used to keep track of, you could say, all the outlets in the top 100 in the United States that published my work. Yeah. And I've yet to crack the top 10, so I haven't been in the New York Times or Chicago Tribune or LA Times or something like that, but I've been knocking around there for the last couple of years.
Yeah, and I saw you on Russia TV.
Yeah. Not
too long ago.
Well, what happened is that I wrote an article. It's amazing how little changes, really, but about a year and a half ago, I wrote an article criticizing intervention in Syria. And I guess that one got a lot of traction, and Counterpunch, you could say, collectivist or Marxist magazine, but an anti-war one that actually has some principle or is against interventionism. Yeah. And they published my article, so it got a lot of traction, and it caught the attention of Russia Today because I guess while they don't give reporting which is critical of the Russian government, and many people would describe them in a very negative manner as a state-oriented media outlet. They do excellent work attacking the U.S. government. And so,
Yeah.
so yeah, they will pick up often very libertarian-leaning people because they know they will openly criticize what the United States is doing.
Right.
And I still think what the U.S. is doing in Syria is just terrible.
Yeah.
And I think that it shows immense hypocrisy among the rulers of the United States. So I'm glad to speak with them. And although I'm not necessarily a specialist in Syria, I speak on that issue all the time because Russia today knows that, one, I feel very strongly about it, and I can defend the point that this is a very destructive engagement, and the people that the U.S. right now is funding are very, how can I describe it? They are destructive and violent in their ways, and the narrative which has changed about that issue is actually kind of revealing to the way that news outlets just kind of flip a story that originally it was an unarmed, peaceful uprising and they were being shot down by the Syrian military, but now apparently we're arming them. And I'm going, so it's just interesting to me, or it's revealing how news stories change. But it also has given me a chance to get on a bigger platform, in Russia Today, which, again, like I said, is a state-run outlet, but they do good work in some instances.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's one of the only sources of news that I even pay attention to anymore.
Oh, right.
It makes more sense. So going back to your site, The Stateless Man, so you just started that as a blog and then it kind of took off from there? Or?
No, I started it was a radio show just to begin with.
Okay.
And I thought, well, I should have some kind of website to go alongside it. And I just registered the domain, thestatelessman.com. Someone still owns statelessman.com and he hasn't been willing to sell it to me. Yeah. So I said, forget it. I'll just just use the Stateless Man. But over the last year or so, I've recruited a professional web designer and I've made it, I hope, a lot slicker and more user-friendly, and I've built an archive. So now most of my audience is through my podcast and website and not through the live show.
Okay.
Which is, I mean, I don't know whether that's a good or bad thing. People don't really call into the online radio networks anyway.
Right.
I guess because they know that a lot of them are just replaying, so it's hard to know whether something is actually live or not. But yeah, it has grown, and most importantly, it's grown rapidly in the last, say, 3 months, which means that finally, after about a year and a half of tacking away at it, it's getting to the point where I can actually monetize it.
That's awesome. Yeah, I subscribe to your podcast because then I can listen to it at any time.
Sure.
And, I just love that you have, it's kind of almost the same stuff that I'm doing here.
Yeah.
But a lot more guests and a lot more different takes. And I like how you have different points of view. Like you're not just going down the political route and you're getting people that, that are kind of traveling the world and living free in an unfree world, but they don't even maybe know the philosophy behind that. So
yeah, that's been a concerted effort of mine from the beginning, that I didn't want it to be just another libertarian podcast.
Right.
Because also that's been a challenge, because I come from a policy wonk background. Not that I am personally, just that happened to be the world that I was working in.
Yeah.
And so those are my friends. Those are the social media people that I'm in touch with. But I really wanted it to be about actually finding freedom and not about politics.
Right.
And I hope that I've achieved that. I'm not sure sometimes. It's a challenge. Some people, I think, don't come on my show because they are uncomfortable with it, but almost everybody still does, regardless of what their political views may be.
Yeah.
Just because, for example, I'll have someone who's being a beauty pageant, entering beauty pageants around the world, and she may not have strong political views, but she's using a certain technique to explore the world, which I think is interesting, and there are plenty of lessons actually to come out of something like that.
Exactly, yeah. And then you had me on the show for a segment there a couple months ago, and we talked about internet business. That's one thing that I focus on too, is that's one way to really get free without, thinking about any of the bigger picture stuff. And really cool. And I know a lot of people that are doing that and traveling the world. So,
right.
Yeah. So, and we're both big fans. I know, and I think almost everyone I've had on the show so far is a fan of Harry Brown's "How I Found Freedom in an Unfree World."
Right.
Yeah. So, in terms of that, how do you define freedom?
Well, that's a very difficult question, actually. It's not as easy as one might think.
Yeah.
The stock answer is to live the life that you want. Like basically, the freedom is, there are two things. One is to have the resources at your disposal, and two is a lack of impediments getting in the way to achieving that. But basically, it is the life you want, and which means both the resources and the lack of impediments. But there's a third branch to it, which is basically the mental capacity to do it as well, because many people don't have actual physical barriers or lack of resources, but they have mental barriers. So there's a whole lot that goes into that. I will say that, finding the life you want is part of it, but then, and Harry Brown does talk about this in this book, there's a whole layer of sort of building your own personal morality. What sort of values do you want to believe in? I mean, that's why I guess it's a never-ending topic.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Because everyone's kind of defining it a little bit differently, and it all kind of depends on what your personal goals are and what you want to get out of life. And
yeah, exactly. And so for you and I, we love to explore, right?
Yeah.
And I would love to just be exploring my whole life.
Right.
But many people don't understand that, and that's fine. I'll say, too, that many people would probably find Harry Brown's book just a bit too much to digest, if it hit them right, if they were to read it just not having any sort of like background in the topic.
Right.
I'm not sure what a better kind of gateway drug would be, but I just know that it's pretty intense for many people. Let's say his views on marriage or parent and child relationships, whatever it may be, they could be unsettling to many people, I suspect.
Oh, yeah. I can vouch for that just in having conversations with people, and especially like the marriage topic. It's really tough because it's something that's just been around for so long that people just think that's what you do. You just get married and you sign a contract with the state, and that's the way it is. And there's no questioning it. But when you bring that up to certain people, it'll inflame the conversation for sure.
Definitely. And that's because we have these assumptions in life, whether we want to recognize them or not, about just kind of like the way it should be. Mm-hmm. And we build, from those assumptions, you could say, different perspectives on other aspects of life or different approaches. Like, we just assume, for example, that, we are loyal Americans and therefore serving the military is a good idea. Or we are loyal Americans, therefore paying taxes is a good idea. Whatever it may be. But from these underlying assumptions, a lot to flow from them. So then that's why I think people are protective of those assumptions, because it would break down a lot of their views on the world more broadly.
Yeah. And going back to what you're saying, it's like Harry Brown's book, it basically challenges every single one of the assumptions that most people live with. So to read that book and just take everything in at once, it's kind of it would be a major shift for most people to do. Unless you were already kind of questioning a lot of things, I think it would be really tough.
Yeah, but because I'm just thinking that, let's say I would have read that as a teenager.
Mm-hmm. So you were saying if you read that as a teenager, it might not have had the same effect?
I'm just not sure whether I would have just thrown it down the ground or what I would have done with it. I don't know. I just know that I've gone through a lot of, you could say, personal changes or awakenings in life, and I'm not the man I was 15 years ago.
Yeah.
And even now, I find Harry Brown's book challenging. Yeah. So for people who are more rigid, I think it would just be, I don't know, I mean, maybe that's why it's not a bestseller, I guess. So,
yeah, that's right.
It's a niche market.
Yeah, when I bought it, I was actually living in Australia at the time, and I was looking for books like that, and I found it, and I looked, and it was like, I think it was $70 to get it, because there were so few copies out there, and then plus the shipping was a little extra, and so, yeah. But it's available now. You can get it for free online, PDF.
Right. That's the way I read it. I think it's really convenient.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, so as far as the stateless concept, I love it, of course, but do you think that someone can truly be stateless and exist in today's world?
That's another great question. Now, the short answer is yes, there are people who are stateless, right? It depends how you define the term. I use it to mean no allegiance or loyalty or obligation to a nation, and to basically just see people in government for what they are, as, we could say them criminals, whatever you want to describe them, basically people who want your money and not in a voluntary manner. But there is a term, statelessness or stateless, that applies to people who simply do not have any nationality and not by their own choice. It's simply because countries come and go and people fall through the cracks. And there apparently, I can't remember how many million people in the world, but there is a good number of people who this has happened to, where the country they were born in either does not exist or does not recognize their citizenship, and so they do not have any passport, birth certificate, any kind of documentation to verify who they are. These people reveal the ugly side or the totally heartless side of government bureaucracy. Mm-hmm. Because these people, their lives are basically over. They cannot do anything. Because the one guy who I'm most familiar with, he got in the United States. I don't know how the heck he got here, but he's from Azerbaijan. And like I said, he's stateless. And simply his travel to American Samoa tripped him up, and he was stuck down there for more than a year. And there are lots of other interviews I've seen online with people like this who can't get a job, can't get a driver's license. You can't do almost anything. People forget how kind of like intertwined we are with government bureaucracy and how the people enforcing these laws, they just don't care.
Yeah. I have an example of this.
Sure.
A friend of mine has a friend that's from South Africa, and he was here in San Diego, and he went across, did a trip to Mexico, just went over the border, and tried to get back in, and they wouldn't let him in. There was some issue, and he basically had to try to fight to get back in the U.S. from Mexico. Ended up having to go back to South Africa, could never come back, and he had like a life here. He was already living in the U.S., and so his life was just like destroyed by these bureaucrats.
Yeah, that's one side of the story. I mean, I know that story, and I've dealt with too many people at the border in my life. I really can't stand it. But there's another side of the story which I think is even worse, really, and that is the way that those people enforcing those rules are basically carrying out the will of many, many people. Mm-hmm. And let me just give you one example. There was a popular image meme, where these are everywhere, saying that illegal immigrants in the United States are better off than war veterans. And I just thought, this is so ridiculous. Mm-hmm. Firstly, how many war veterans are getting deported? Around 400,000 people are getting deported to this country, and they're not war veterans.
Right.
That's probably the worst thing that can happen to you. Secondly, would any one of these war veterans trade places with an illegal immigrant? Of course not.
Right.
But this kind of silly and, in my view, hateful rhetoric flows all over the place.
Yeah.
And if that sort of silly rhetoric and silly viciousness were not around, you could say the viciousness of the bureaucracy would have no real source. But it flows because people are pushing for it. And I do my best to try and, quell that or respond to it. But I'm just one man. I can't turn around 300 million people in the country.
Oh, come on, Ferg. You can do that. You've got a radio show. You can do anything.
Yeah. So I think nobody can because for whatever reason, maybe it's just instinct, we have this fear of the term foreigner, even though we don't really know what that means. And like I said, we can discuss the fact that nations don't really exist or borders are confused because they change all the time. But for whatever reason, we still do have this fear of what a foreigners may be. And
yeah, that's a great topic. The idea that borders don't exist, and that's something that is really hard for people to wrap their head around. But you and I agree on that. Why do you think that is, or what does that really mean? And then why is it that borders are not compatible with freedom?
Again, a great question because, well, firstly, they do and they don't. They exist in people's minds, right? So people who wearing shiny badges and uniforms, they think there's some kind of meaning to a line on the ground which we've created, and they will fight you to defend them. They will get in your way. So insofar as there are people believing in them, borders do exist. Insofar as there's some kind of meaning or basis for them, they don't. And one of the key reasons why they don't exist, at least if you want to understand this, is that they move. On what grounds they move? Really just arbitrary manner. So I'm guessing half the people in the United States don't even know that there were only 13 original colonies, or that Puerto Rico is part of the United States, or that American Samoa is part of the United States, or whatever it may be. Mm-hmm. They have no clue that these places or new places are part of the country. So I always ask people if they say, for example, I want to defend the United States. Well, I say, are you going to send, do you want to defend American Samoa? Is that part of the United States? And I think the concept of what this country or what these borders mean just kind of like erodes away. Yeah. And additionally, people, I think, maybe forget that most of these borders came into existence just through wars. What has it got to do with you or anything, really? It's just some people at some certain time, killed better than, were more successful at killing their opponents than their opponents were, and happened to decide a line there. Well, who cares? That has no meaning to me, and it shouldn't have any meaning to anyone else. So I think the problem is that we probably within us, again, a bit like the fear of foreigners, we have this perhaps tribalist instinct to kind of like fight for our tribe or whatever it is, and that is handy or it's convenient to people who control these ideas of borders and they want us to give our allegiance to them. But I've said this before, I'm confident that things are changing in this regard, that you could say the rise of alternative media just like ours is giving more awareness of alternative perspectives on the issue of borders, and that there's going to be a change in the next 20, 30 years. I'm not holding my breath, but I'm just saying that I think there is a greater awareness of this fact.
Yeah, and I think adding to that, the rise of the mobile business or the location-independent entrepreneur is actually helping change things, because people start to, you move out somewhere, like you grow up in the U.S. and you start a business and then you move to Thailand or something, and then all of a sudden you realize like you're following these laws from a country that's 8,000 miles away that has really nothing to do with your life, and it doesn't make any sense, because even, I grew up in California on the West Coast, and it would always seem weird to me that Washington, D.C. was 3,000 miles away and they were telling us how to live our lives. And it's like, how does that make any sense at all, just because of where I was born? And so,
if I may interrupt there, that's an important thought that I had in my own life, that basically when I was back in New Zealand, I had that same epiphany. I just said, I'm ruled from Wellington, which is the capital of New Zealand, but I've never been there.
Yeah.
What place do they have to tell me what to do? I don't really get it. And I don't really understand why everyone else just sort of accepted that. But that's probably something that still occurs to this day, that I don't really understand why people just sort of take those things as a given.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but like you said, I'm with you. I'm more positive on the future and what's going to happen. And there's a book that I read probably 10 years ago now called The Sovereign Individual. Have you read that book?
Okay. No, but I've heard it referred to plenty of times.
Okay, yeah. Well, that's kind of describing this future, and it was written in 1997, and they predicted all these things that are sort of happening now. They predict the collapse of the nation state and how it was going to look, and they have this idea that the U.S. is going to break up into different regions, and there's going to be, just not because any philosophical change or because people want to give up their power, but because of just the way government operates, it's going to break down, it's going to collapse, and
sure,
then
that's great.
Yeah, we're going to have smaller government, smaller regions, and things like that. Which, who knows? I mean, that could be that might happen and might not. But I'd rather talk about the philosophy and kind of get that out there, and then just live that freedom. Kind of be as free as possible in whatever the conditions are in the world. So,
sure.
There's a quote from your site that I liked, and I wanted to talk about it a little bit more. I'll read the quote. You said, "My primary conclusion has been that if you want to live a certain way and find greater independence in your life, you can do so through personal initiative, as opposed to relying on the actions of others or political changes." So can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, that line is just basically the heart of my show, that there seems to be a tendency, which I have a temptation towards, to want to change others rather than change yourself. Mm-hmm. And this manifests itself in the political realm, where people think that in order to achieve goals, they've got to change other people's minds or get them to vote or whatever it may be. Given my background, given my work in policy research with think tanks, being involved in the political realm, I guess I see two things really. One is that, like I said, you personally, one person, the incremental change that you may have on any political outcome is so minuscule, we might as well not even talk about it.
Yeah.
So if you think, for example, that you are going to get rid of the income tax as one man, well, good luck.
Right.
Additionally, so on one hand, there was this futility. On the other hand, I realized, and this is kind of an unsavory reality, that many people make money out of tricking you into getting involved in the political process. Mm-hmm. Now, I was not aware of this until I started working in the think tank. So basically, firstly, think tanks make money out of you donating to them. But when I was working for one in Louisiana, for example, an energy lobbying group flew, I'm thinking hundreds of people from Louisiana up to Washington, D.C. to go on a kind of like a protest march and speak, and I was recruited as a reporter to cover the event. And I was just thinking, who's paying for all this?
Yeah.
The amount of, I find just what governments spend as nightmarish or enough already, let alone this whole industry that surrounds it and lobbies it and consumes a bunch of the economy as well.
Right.
So I saw one, this is futility, but people are going to try and trick you into getting involved because they profit from it. And another good example, it was this right to work battle, or I think pension scheme battle up in Wisconsin. And just, I'm thinking tens of thousands of people, maybe 100,000 people, so many people flocked to Wisconsin. Lots of people I knew flocked there. I was offered free flights to get there. And I was thinking, look at all the resources that people, look at how profitable this little industry is. I don't want it to take any more of my money. And so when you accept that the political realm is, you could say, not incrementally in your interest, and it is a way to take more of your time and money, and then you bring that back to the local level, you say, well, okay, what is most productive just with my own actions? Let's say I don't get along with my brother. Should I try and change my brother, or should I just like not hang around with him? We have two options with life. We can try and change others or change ourselves. And my own personal kind of like transition has just been to try and change myself as much as possible, which is an ongoing challenge. We're humans or whatever. But I will say that has given me so much more peace in my life that it's amazing how not recognizing that someone else's life is his property and it's not your responsibility is just a stress release, really.
It is, yeah.
And I just think you don't need to stress about me. I won't stress about you. If you need help, come to me, that's fine. But I just think so if you want to live a certain way, just go from A to B, which means changing your own life and not changing other people. And that doesn't mean other people aren't going to get in your way. That's just the reality we live in. But we still have to be pragmatic about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that I was reading back a few years ago, a guy named Stefan Molyneux, I don't know if you're familiar with him.
Yeah, I'm very familiar with him, yeah.
Yeah, so he pointed out something about, because I used to be sort of interested in politics, and I helped with the Ron Paul campaign back in 2008. And that was kind of my last go-around with anything political. And once I started listening to Molyneux, he pointed out something that was like, it's so obvious now looking back on it, but at the time it just hit me really hard, was that if you're going to try to change like a whole political system, like a whole country, why not start with something smaller? Like, you want to take over the U.S. government, that's a pretty huge project. What about just infiltrating the mafia? Like, just change the mafia. It's not as big as the government, so you could just turn that around. Go into the mafia and tell them to stop killing people. And it's like, or the KKK or something. Try to get the KKK to not be racist or something like that.
What's the conclusion from that, piece of advice? I don't really understand.
Well, because these are smaller organizations that you could, if it were true that you could go and politically affect the U.S. government, let's say, then you should be able to easily go into these smaller groups and change them. So why not start there, prove that you can do it with a smaller organization, and then move up to the government level?
Yeah, I'll say actually there are other things that come to mind when you mention that. Firstly, whenever you change government, you've got to recognize that there are vested interests and people who are just as motivated as you, unfortunately, to basically push in the opposite direction. So any kind of gain you have is likely to be pushed back against in the future. But one of the saddest aspects to me of the political realm is the way that it promotes dishonesty. And this really kills me because, I like to believe that it hasn't impacted me or that I've still kept my, integrity. But I will say that what happens in the think tank and political realm is that basically people forget what the truth is because they never say what they really believe. They say what they think is politically pragmatic.
Right.
And after a few years in that, I think people just forget what truth is anymore. They forget what they really believe. And they live in this kind of phony reality where in the think tank realm, there's what's called the Overton window. That is what is politically feasible. And we're not going to talk about anything that's outside of the Overton window. So secession, that's off the table.
Right.
And I would say, well, I don't care about this Overton window. Like, it's not my nature to make these phony arguments that I don't really believe in. Yeah. And so, for example, in the think tank realm too, people will promote things like what they call, quote, school choice, which means school vouchers or whatever it may be. And rather than what they really believe, which may be just let's close the government schools. And I don't want to be part of the problem because when I grew up, I'd never heard about the ideas of liberty because everyone around me, all the adults, all the kind of talking heads, all the commentators, all the reporters, they were speaking within this little window, and that meant my brain was stuck in the window.
Yeah.
And I don't want to be confined by that.
Yeah, absolutely. When people say think outside of the box, like a lot of those people are still within this box, and they're like, "Oh, I'm thinking about
probably."
The box. And it's yeah. You really have to. That's an interesting idea, that Overton window. I hadn't thought of it like that, but definitely, that's definitely all around us. So as far as traveling goes, I want to talk a little bit about traveling because I know you're big on it and you've got a lot of really cool, interesting guests on your show. So through all your interviews, what have you found to be some of the best interviews or the most interesting ways to travel the world?
Probably my favorite episode, this one was quite a while ago, but was about couch surfing, right? Mm-hmm. And I should really back up a little bit because you asked about being stateless and living, beyond nationality, and can someone actually do that? I didn't really address that question well because I maybe addressed the kind of like theoretical idea of actually not having a nation.
Sure.
But I'll just say that living the way that I do and perhaps the way that you do too comes with much more complexities than I initially anticipated.
Yeah.
And one of the problems is that, you and I and many other people, we think beyond nationality, and we think about just, volunteer engagement or whatever it may be. That doesn't mean the rest of the world does. And so let me give you two examples. When I was in Massachusetts for about 6 months, I wanted to buy a car. Well, I didn't have a permanent address, and I didn't have a driver's license from Massachusetts. I still have my New Zealand license. And suddenly you realize that the world just isn't kind of set up for people who are nomadic.
Yeah.
And also, I wanted to retain my privacy. So in the end, I did get a U.S. Social Security number because I needed one to get a job. But I never used it on any of my bills. I opened up a bank account without one. And suddenly, I didn't have, a credit report or I didn't exist as far as credit agencies went. Like, there was no Fergus Hodgson. And then I went to go and buy a car. Well, you would have to either pay cash up front for that. So suddenly, I came across these challenges that I didn't really anticipate. That's just because everyone else was kind of stuck in this other way of life, and I had to kind of engage with it.
Yep. And
so I will say that that's one of the reasons why I guess I do my show, because I want to be not necessarily a role model, but just someone who can offer support getting through these challenges, because it hasn't been an easy road, that's for sure. Now, in terms of the traveling, though, I think that the couchsurfing one was best because it's been a big part of my life, although I haven't been using it lately. But at one time, I used this, you could say, travel network to meet some of my best friends now. And just this Friday, I'm going back to Colombia, and I'm going to be there for a month or two.
Nice.
And my first host, who was in Armenia, Colombia, he is going to be meeting me at the airport and take me to his place, and we're going to get set up there. I'm going to go on a day of presentations or whatever at his English school. And so basically, through this couchsurfing network, I've met an incredible number of fascinating people. And I get kind of emotional thinking about it, actually, because that was a really fascinating time. In particular, my trip to Latin America was a fascinating time for me. And I had a bunch of them on my show, one guy over from Switzerland in the middle of the night. And so it just brought back lots of memories. And I think perhaps because that network and the people I met were ones who didn't really care about the conventional way of life, the 9-to-5 existence. They don't really know what that is.
Right.
And I think more people live outside of the 9-to-5 existence than many people realize. But the problem is that if you are living in it, you mix with other people who are living in it too. Mm-hmm. And you don't really know. So, for example, I remember when I was at university in New Zealand, I'd just gone through conventional education like everyone else. But there were people there who had been homeschooled and who were just going to university when they were much younger. And I'm going, well, why didn't I do that? I didn't even know you could do that.
Yeah.
But for them, it was just normal. You don't have to obey these rules. But if you were inside them, then you don't even realize often. So again, I thought these people, they get made for a great show, but they also just basically they just let that kind of conventional way of life go, or they had let it go a long time ago.
Yeah, that is awesome. I use couchsurfing.org also, and yeah, it's really interesting, all the people that you meet, and it's kind of all walks of life. I mean, I think there's this kind of a myth out there that couchsurfing is for young people that are in their early 20s and kind of vagabonding around the world and just crashing on couches and stuff. But I met people that are making a ton of money that are doing it, and
what?
All kinds.
Oh, you mean just well-off people who are using the service?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, they just they use it for they either host people or travel and meet people, because it's a better way. Rather than just getting hotels everywhere, it's a better way to meet people. So
yeah, I've hosted more people than I've stayed with, actually, and I will say that there is. I mean, it's hard for me I don't have a purely random sample, but I will say there's a tendency of, you could say, people who are not necessarily libertarian-minded, but I don't know, that doesn't really bother me. I'll just say, you get a chance to choose. I do still use that website in terms of when I'm traveling, just to kind of meet people in the area, although these days I know so many people now that I don't really need it. It's kind of become superfluous, but I still think there is value to it. And, I'll probably bring it up on my show again in the near future.
Cool. Yeah, I love the travel stuff and all the interviews and all the different ways that people are doing this. And again, it's I think that there's another myth out there that you have to have a lot of money to travel the world, and you really don't. Not,
Yeah.
You've definitely discovered that. And the thing is, it's not like you're slumming it either. If you have some way to get income as you travel, you don't have to go, too ghetto as you go. So there's definitely a lot of different ways to do it.
There are two things I want to say to that. One is that there is actually an irony to that. People will say, I don't have enough money to travel, but as you well know, if you actually go to the hostels in many places, basically the people who are there are poor. That many of the travelers are just kind of squeaking by. And that's part of the adventure of it, I guess, that you don't really need a lot. And one of the reasons is that once you start acquiring possessions, so for example, I now own a car, which is kind of like a big deal after being a traveler for such a long time. It's kind of a pain in the butt to get rid of. I don't really know. So I'm going down to Colombia for a few months. I don't really know when I'm going to be back in the United States.
Yeah.
So these possessions And I'm going, where do I put this? And, what if I don't even get back? What if I'm like that South African friend of yours and I can't get back in the country? What am I going to do with my car?
Yeah.
So there are complications that come with possessions. And I didn't realize how liberating it was that everything I owned, I could just put on my back.
Yeah. And I'm actually going to be interviewing one of the guys from the minimalists.com next week. Mm-hmm. And so, I think minimalism and freedom go hand in hand for sure. So do you think that we can achieve more freedom by moving? I mean, you have a lot on your site in terms of like the freest states in the U.S. and the freest countries and things like that. Are you still kind of on the mindset of that if we move to the right place and live in the right area and have our bank account in a certain place, that we can have a little more freedom?
Like I said, these are really challenging questions. Firstly, you've got to recognize, and as I have, that the reality we live in, there just isn't a libertarian haven to go to.
Sure.
And there may never be one. I don't know why it is that most people don't think like we do, but they don't.
Yeah.
And that's not to say that I'm not eager for it to happen, and I'm going to keep pushing and following like opportunities where this may be coming to existence. And I've followed, for example, the special development regions idea in Honduras and hope that comes. But the key is, like I said, there is not a libertarian haven. Hong Kong is not a libertarian haven, nor is Singapore, nor New Zealand. But there are variations in freedom around the world. So, for example, in New Hampshire, you don't need a license to buy a gun. Anybody, I don't even know whether you need to be of age, can basically buy a gun and open carry without any kind of restriction. And it's not only...
People aren't going around killing each other there, right?
Right, it's actually a very safe place, right? And what's more important is not only is it not illegal, there is a cultural acceptance, which is half the challenge.
Yeah.
You can't do that in New Zealand. So, but, maybe you and I enjoy the beach. You're from California. I'm from near the coast in New Zealand as well. And we want to enjoy the climate and the beach in New Zealand. And in New Zealand, there's just a ton of beachfront property that's available for next to nothing. Mm-hmm. So if that's part of finding freedom in your life, then maybe you want to move to New Zealand and you don't care so much about owning guns, and you can still own them in New Zealand, but you just can't. There are more barriers in the way.
Sure.
So it's really a case-by-case basis, and it is true. So it's faster than trying to wait for political change, that's for sure. But there are transactions costs, and I don't have an easy answer to that. Like, there is variation, and you can find a better life through migration, but it's not the answer for everybody.
Right.
And there's no, perfect place to flee to. As much as people are trying, all over the place, people are building different communities of a certain inclination. But I just don't see that happening. And also, after living in Ecuador for a while, I realized that even in a place like Ecuador, one of the, quote, least free countries on the planet, that you can still have a good life in a place like that.
Sure.
That, for example, I met a guy there who was from California, and he said that to open up a restaurant that could serve liquor, I think costed him something like $100,000 just to get licensed in Los Angeles.
Yeah.
And he said that in Ecuador, he didn't even need a license. And I'm going, well, that's great. And so, So even Ecuador, the supposedly unfree place, is freer than the United States in some regards. And I also recognize, too, that we can become too kind of like, not obsessed, but just too worried about laws, because the fact is that our ancestors, almost all of them, lived under tyranny for their whole lives. They lived and died under tyranny. So we should really get on with trying to enjoy our lives, despite the fact that there is some tyranny, but there's still plenty of opportunity as well.
Yeah. A couple things on that. One is that you were talking about Ecuador and how it seems, it's a third world country and there's not as much freedom there. But
right.
It's the same when I went to Bali last year. And pretty much in Bali, it's like, there's all kinds of corruption in the Indonesian government, and it's pretty crazy place. But you have some freedoms that you don't have here. So I was there for a month, and then when I was back here, we had a bonfire on the beach when I got back, and
okay.
We're standing there, and it's probably about 10:30 at night, and we had a couple wine bottles by the fire, and then out of nowhere, these two cops pulled up on four-wheelers, and we all thought, of course, they're going to bust us because alcohol is illegal on the beach. And so, but the fact is nobody was actually drinking at the time they pulled up. So what they did is because we put our glasses on the ground, on the sand, they cited one of the guys for littering. And just so that they could get us on something. And it's a $600 fine for littering.
Whoa. This is in California, $600?
Yeah. So, well, it's not,
Whoa.
Obviously we weren't littering. We had stuff there that we were obviously going to take with us. But, there's two cops, and there's about 6 or 7 of us, And, they're writing the ticket, like, what are we going to do? They wanted us to say something. They wanted us to try to argue with them. And so if we did, it would have been a worse fine. So I was thinking about that compared to Bali, where that would be, it's such a joke to drink alcohol on the beach is like, it's not even on the radar there. I mean, they have so many other things going on.
Right. And I'll say, too, that, I know those fines are out of control. And I wrote about red light cameras, and you can get, I think it's a $475 fine just for not coming to a complete stop at a red light and taking a right-hand turn in Los Angeles.
Yeah.
So there is this, I'm not sure, extortion racket in terms of fines going on. And I'm surprised because, this reputation of the U.S. as the home of the free doesn't carry true in many instances. I remember when I first went to swim at a lake here, they had this net around the little inlet, and you weren't allowed to swim outside the net, just in the lake general. And I was obviously swimming outside of it, but they were on me like bees to honey. And I was going, why do you care that I'm swimming in a different part of the lake? What is the deal? But so there, for whatever reason, many aspects of, you could say, local governance in the United States are hostile to freedom. And I don't really know what to say about that. It's an observation that I've had over the last couple of years.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree. And it sounds kind of like we're bashing like the U.S. or something. And there are definitely there's a lot of things here that are more free than most of the world. But it's just these instances where it's like, I can do something easily and freely in another country, and here I get tagged with a $600 fine. So.
Yeah, the big advantage with the United States is that you have a community of freedom lovers, right?
Yeah.
That even if you're in the minority, there still is this, I'm not sure how to describe it, but group of people who really just dearly appreciate freedom.
Yeah.
So you have allies. The problem is that the people in government are very sophisticated. So in developing countries, you don't necessarily have the group of freedom lovers, but you don't have a sophisticated government to control you. Exactly. So, but I very much appreciate having that community here, which I don't know you could find anywhere on the planet.
That's exactly, yeah. And that's what I've said for so long about why do I stay in the U.S. And, I'm sitting here complaining about this law and that law. But it comes down to what you just said, is that the idea of liberty, it doesn't even exist in most of the world. Even in places like I was in Australia for 2 months, and I didn't feel like that place had any concept of liberty, even though it's it's a first world country. There's a lot of economic opportunity there. And it's modern, and they've got a lot of stuff, but they just didn't have, it was like you pay your taxes and you go to the pub, and that's it. And there's no questioning anything. So
I share that, and I'll say that's the same with New Zealand too. And sometimes I forget about this, but recently I watched a news clip from New Zealand with a kind of like a quote panel discussion. And this is on New Zealand's #1 channel. And everyone on the panel was just dissing Bitcoin because it was individualist, as though being individualist was just a terrible thing.
Wow, that's amazing.
And suddenly all these memories just came back from, whoa, like I know what that was like to be surrounded by that kind of culture where to be an individualist is just that's a horror.
Yeah. And
New Zealand is probably one of the most freedom-minded places on the planet after the United States, ironically.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Well, it's too bad. They'll be late in the game and getting on Bitcoin while the rest of the world has already moved on from the fiat.
Probably.
Currencies.
Yeah.
So, but anyway, yeah. So as far as resources go, we've talked about how I found freedom in an unfree world. Of course. Do you have any other books? Like, what are your favorite books or podcasts or websites that you like to kind of go to?
Yeah, I've got so many these days, and I'll just say we live in a wonderful era when you can choose the media you want to take in. Mm-hmm. And a large amount of the media I take in is basically selected by my friends that they email or tweet to me or Facebook post to me. Yep. And I think that's just great. I love it, and I use Reddit a lot. So probably my leading, news outlets are Reddit, Twitter, Facebook, and email updates, right? So those are basically targeted news sources. There are many different books I've read in terms of actually, understanding the world, and you can say political philosophy or political economy. The 2 books that I recommend that are really accessible, which could be gateway drugs, I guess, to how I found freedom in an unfree world, would be The Law by Frederick Bastiat, which is really short, and that's free online too, or $5 or $10 if you want to order a copy.
Sure.
And then Economics in One Lesson, which is, I think, 60 years old now, by Henry Hazlitt. And that's just a beautiful book, which I recommend too, about basically just understanding economics. And I wish that more people would just read that rather than take lots of economics courses at a university. That book would be enough.
Yep.
But then if people want a more sophisticated or in-depth understanding of, you could say, the monetary system and international politics, I recommend The Creature from Jekyll Island by G. Edward Griffin.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think now, my own interests are transitioning right now away from, you could say, the political economic realm to more of finance and, you could say, just understanding Latin America, because that's become my kind of like hobby of interest.
Sure.
And so in the future, I'm going to be looking into more basically investment books. I mean, I've got the one, Rich Dad, Poor Dad, and many others like it, because I recognize now more and more how money or finance is just so important, and you can ignore it at your peril. You can just have this free mindset, but if no one's paying the bills, you're going to be a burden upon other people, and that's really frustrating.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you got to be informed with all this stuff. So cool. Well, let's. I know we've been chatting for a while, but I'm going to wrap it up here. What are your plans for your show now, and what about personal goals and things like that coming up? I know you're going to Colombia.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you. So basically, the show is continuing to grow incrementally. I'm just keeping it going as it is. Basically, that I'm happy with it in its current format. I'm seeking to pick up more affiliates and expand its audience, but that's about it. I don't want to really mess with it right now.
Yeah.
My major new project, though, is I'm founding a new media outlet in English, but there'll be some Spanish as well, to cover the entire American continent. It's the Pan American Post, or Pan Am Post,
Okay.
and just panampost.com. It's going to be going live from July 1st. And right now we're in the logo development and website development process. And it will, like I said, it'll be live from July 1st. But basically, it's going to be like a Reason magazine or Daily Caller or news and opinion outlet with a blog component to zone in on Latin America in particular, but also the entire continent, because that, as you know, that there's so much kind of like movement in between that you might as well just put them together.
Yeah.
And so that's my major project, and that's one reason why I'm getting back to Colombia right away, because I want my Spanish to be at a professional level.
Okay.
And in August, I'm going to Guatemala for a couple of conferences. Beyond that, I don't know where I'm living, and I'm kind of excited about that prospect, really.
You're a PT, right? Permanent traveler? So
I'm not right now.
Yeah.
I'm not right now because, but this is one problem which people may want to consider, actually. And we could talk on for long about this, but basically one of the challenges I've faced with the lifestyle I have, and I imagine you face this one too, is building a solid relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't mind saying on air that I would like to have a good relationship and a family at some point. And in the long run, I recognize that that's going to require a little bit more stability than being a permanent tourist. Even though I personally enjoy being a permanent tourist and have been one at times, I just recognize that it's not really good for a family life or building a solid relationship unless you have a woman who's so inclined.
Yeah, so great point on that. So the idea of permanent traveler or perpetual tourist or anything like that, we talked about it a lot on my last show with Steve Michaels, and it's more of a mindset than it is an actual like putting it to use. I mean, it's great to have the ability to travel permanently or to be a perpetual tourist, but you don't always have to use it. So the idea is to not be tied to a particular place that you have to live in because of whatever reason, but you can be a PT and still stay, spend most of your time in the same place. And the second thought on that I have is that if you're someone that likes to travel the world and you want to see a lot of places, but you, instead of doing that, you stay in one place because you want to establish a relationship and kind of eventually have a family and things like that, I think it's going to be harder actually than if you went out and lived the way you want to live. So in other words, you kind of pursue your passion and then something happens along the way rather than trying to make things happen where you are and then go off and live your life. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I do get it. I face that dilemma all the time because I might meet a woman in the United States, but I personally would like to go and live in Chile.
Yeah.
And I don't have a good answer to that question. We face trade-offs in life all the time. I'm cognizant of that fact that relationships exist primarily, physically in person, and if you're living on the other side of the planet, that's a challenge. And I'll just say, too, that the costs associated with being a PT are large.
Yeah.
So that's why the only people who really do it are ones who have a very strong aversion towards, you could say, any kind of government allegiance, whatever. And I may be one of those people. But it is the case that only very few people do this because the transactions costs, incorporating internationally, having different, like an address, like a mail service, someone take care of your mail service, for example. All these complications arise that you might not foresee to begin with. And you've got to learn to reconcile with those. And it's like basically like a many years-long process of building into it.
Yeah, I think you can do it a little faster than that. I think it's more of there's a kind of a learning curve at the beginning, but once you get used to that, kind of the things that you have to do, it's not that hard. It just kind of becomes second nature. And I think there's also a lot of people that they're not necessarily like us, where they're philosophically minded and they have any kind of, they're not against paying taxes or any of that, but they also want to have that freedom to be able to travel, and becoming a permanent tourist or a PT is appealing to them because it allows them to do this in a more free way, and then not have to pay as much taxes. I mean, there's so many ways you can cut down on the taxes that you're paying, and not be doing anything illegal. So,
well, you don't have to be an anarchist to want to not pay taxes or pay lower taxes. But I just say a few years, because there's a difference between going off on an extended vacation, which many of us do, and actually living a sustainable life like that.
Yeah.
That's where it becomes more complicated. So, for example, if you continue to not live anywhere beyond more than 6 months of the year, you might have a difficult time getting a driver's license, for example. Mm-hmm. Or you might have a more difficult time opening bank accounts, or just things get more complicated in a sustainable manner. And I just know the financial side is important too. Many people maybe are smarter than me with building online businesses, and kudos, I want to learn from them. But I've had a hard time making money on the road so far. And I'm only after a few years of this am I getting to the point where I can actually make that happen. I've had to learn. It's very much a learning process.
Yeah, for sure. It's not easy. None of it's easy. So it's all a trade-off. I mean, I'd be less happy if I just stayed in one place and tried to live a quote-unquote normal life. So, yeah, that's the trade-off you make.
Likewise.
Yeah, awesome. Well, Fergus, it's been great having you on the show. It's been really fun chatting. Again, it's Fergus Hodgson, and his website is thestatelessman.com.
Right, and probably the best way to follow me is to go to the Facebook page, which is facebook.com/thestatelessman, or Twitter @the Stateless Man. I'll say, Kevin, I follow your page and enjoy it, so freedom loving, and it's my pleasure. I hope I gave you as much insights as you might have expected. I'm not sure.
Sweet, yeah, probably a lot more, actually.
Okay, mate. We'll be in touch online, I guess.
For sure, yeah. Thanks, and good luck with everything, and good luck with Colombia.
Sounds good, mate.